Today I'll be showing you how to efficiently crank out a ridiculous amount of cakes to force feed your pals in your sick underground mass breeding operation, along with the optimized base setup to go with it, all the ins and outs of breeding perfectly rolled pals, and how to properly use breeding charts to breed up from low tier pals to endgame pals in as little steps as possible. There are some fascinating discoveries I'll be sharing that will help you better understand why this setup works best, and why we'll be avoiding doing certain things that would normally seem logical that a lot of people have got completely wrong, because when you actually run the numbers, you realize they don't function as intended at all. Let's make some cakes. For any breeding to take place, one aphrodisiac cake is required for every one pal egg produced. Our 5 critical ingredients are flour, which is made from 3 wheat, red berries, milk, egg, and honey, all of which we can purchase for gold from merchants if we'd like, with the exception of honey. For this reason, honey is our most important ingredient to maximize production for optimal cake output, while we can be a little more selective about how we obtain the others. Wheat and berries are extremely easy to farm and practical to stockpile for jam-filled buns as well, so having a base with both is recommended. However, I suggest keeping it separate from where we produce our other 3 ingredients, which requires ranches to create, and you'll see why in a minute. Where you choose to process your wheat into flour is up to you. It won't really matter, though it's probably best to do so on a dedicated farming base. Just toss down as many wheat and berry plots as you can, and ideally keep your feed box and a cooler storage within the center of them so that there's less movement required in order to store them once they're harvested. Eggs and milk are created by chickpeas and mozzarinas respectively, though I'm going to suggest you minimize using mozzarinas to produce milk, and instead purchase most of your milk for 50 gold each from the merchant located at the small settlement at coordinates 73, -484. You can also capture him if you have the means to, and pull him out at your base when you need to buy and sell stuff if it's more convenient. The reasons we want to do this is because it's significantly easier to mass capture and rank up chickpeas for greater egg production than it is to get mozzarinas for milk. We also need 1 more egg than milk per cake, so favoring egg production makes more sense. We also have limited spaces in our base for production, so less pals overall is better. And chickpeas have smaller character models that are less likely to bug out in your base than mozzarinas. There are tons of videos on how to make fast money in Palworld, but one of the simplest ways is just to convert regular ingots into nails and sell them. If you haven't already watched my video on how to set up automated ingot production, then that's a great place to start to ensure you have steady coins to fund your cake baking efforts. Every ore is effectively worth 160 gold when converted to nails, so you can get 3.2 milk per ore, which is pretty darn good in my opinion, and it simply draws from what should be an already steady pile of ore if you have a properly functioning mining base. Of course, you're welcome to use mozzarinas if you prefer that. You just need to give up an extra pal box slot at one of your bases to support them. If you're just drowning in money, you could opt to purchase your eggs as well instead of farming them, or any of the other resources than honey for that matter. Finally, for honey production, we're going to need bee guards, and a lot of them. Ideally, they'll be one of the first pals we breed or mass capture to increase their star ranking, as the only thing that notably increases resource production from our range pals is their partner skill level, which goes up by 1 level for each star ranking. I've done a number of tests looking at different work speed levels by boosting with passive skills, with the monitoring stand, and different foods that boost work speed, and there was no significant difference that made it worth using any of those features. When you level their partner skill, however, this seems to specifically change how many of the farmable resources dropped when they trigger a resource drop. For example, a 0-star chickpea will always drop 1 egg, whereas a 1-star has a chance to drop 2, and a 4-star has a chance to drop 5 in a row. This isn't guaranteed, it's simply a chance. It'll roll between 1 and that max number. I haven't noticed the star rating changing the frequency of the resource drop actually occurring. That seems to be the same at all levels, where it hovers around 45 seconds to 2 minutes per drop, and does not work like clockwork on a fixed drop schedule. I've seen some people say that higher work speeds speed up the animation of the resource drop, but I honestly couldn't even tell the difference between a pal with double work speed versus normal, so it's pretty much irrelevant. This is nice because it means you won't have to look for skills like artisan or other work boosting skills ever when it comes to ranch pals. Instead, the skills that actually matter the most are the ones that reduce sand depletion and hunger depletion, because that means less time resting and eating from feed boxes, which equals more grazing time and more resources produced per hour. Anything that boosts move speed is also beneficial, obviously, so I suggest all of these following skills to prioritize if you have a large pool of ranch pals to choose from. It's by no means a hard requirement, but it will improve your output. Diet lover, workaholic, and dainty eater are probably the best to look for. Swift and runner are useful. Legend and nimble are also good, but slightly worse. For base placement location, it's really a matter of preference, though I found that coordinates 398, -318 were a perfect spot, as it has a giant chunk of flat land to work off, with minimal trees that I needed to clear, on top of having very frequent chickpea spawns, which were great for power leveling my initial workers to higher egg laying tiers. I've also never been raided here, which I found quite interesting. Maybe that's a fluke, but it's pretty nice not having to deal with raids here as well. If you're doing an honest, unmodified playthrough, this spot will be great to zoom around for chickpeas, catching 1 to 2 at a time. But if you want to and are able to change your world settings to increase PAL spawn rate, you could easily catch over 100 chickpeas here in a few minutes with tripled spawn rates. Before dropping my PAL box, I've started laying full stone foundations for all of my bases to give me a completely flat working space to use so that I can minimize the likelihood of my PALs getting bugged out as well. I would say this is worth doing, but it's not a must if you're too lazy or don't have the stone to spare. A pro tip for doing this is to mark where you want your PAL box center to be, then find the absolute highest elevation point within an 8 to 10 square radius of the PAL box, and then build your foundation out from there. This will ensure that your foundation always stays at the highest point of the ground in your workable base area. I've opted to turn off my structure deterioration rate so that I can build outside my PAL box range. Just keep in mind that you still can't have PALs work outside of that range. This is just for decorative purposes. For ranch placements, I think 4 ranches is the absolute most you'd ever need if you're playing on a world with 20 max PALs, as you can have a maximum of 4 PALs working on a single ranch at any given time. This would leave you with room for 1 cooling PAL, 1 electricity PAL, and 2 PALs to actively breed if you're focusing on gathering cake materials. You can then choose to scale down your cake resource PALs for more active breeding PALs as your needs adjust. Personally, I run 12 ranch PALs, 1 cooling, 1 electricity, 1 fire, 1 Anubis to help pick up ranch drops, and 4 breeding PALs when I'm not power farming eggs, which is usually more than enough to supply all my cake needs, with my berries and wheat coming from a separate base, plus buying all my milk. This is something you'll have to play around with to find your equilibrium point, based on the levels of your ranch PALs and how much of your milk and or eggs you're purchasing. When laying down your ranches, I like to place them on the outermost edge of the building ring, and as long as your PALs actively help to build it when you place it down, you know that it'll be properly used by your ranch PALs. Between each pair of ranches, I put a feed box to minimize the distance traveled to eat so that we get more time for grazing, while also putting a storage barrel inside of each ranch so that my bee guards or Anubis can instantly deposit honey into it. Then we put a cooler in the middle of all the ranches where any milk or eggs will be deposited, with the least distance possible traveled to deposit, while only needing 1 cooling PAL to manage it. If you have enough flour and berries being produced at your farming base, then I highly recommend you convert as much spare flour as you can into jam-filled buns, as they'll dramatically reduce the amount of eating your PAL needs to do compared to regular cooked berries, especially normal uncooked berries. Cooked berries are a pretty solid food all around though, so if you can't afford to push to jam buns, then don't sweat it. Just know that the sand recovery from cooked berries is not even close to as good as the jam buns. When loading up your feeders, make sure you're putting your food that you intend to be eaten on the leftmost side, then fill all remaining slots with a non-perishable food item like honey or cotton candy, so that any eggs or milk you produce on the ranch gets funneled to your freezer so it doesn't spoil. One last thing you want to do is put a hot spring of the highest quality possible on each side of your ranches so that PALs that need to restore sand occasionally have a place to go quickly. PAL beds are simple, just put as many down as you have PALs and use the highest quality possible. I always like to put 2 large PAL beds and the rest fluffy, with them all spaced 1 tile apart to minimize collisions, with the large beds not near any larger structure like a ranch, stable, or hot spring, as I've seen PALs bug out when they're too close together. Finally, I place my base and PAL performance enhancing structures and all other large objects that PALs are not interacting with, like the PAL condenser, your bed, monitoring stand, statue of power, and alarm bell, above my main working floor. I highly recommend making this 4 tiles higher than your main working area, as Alpha Jormunganders will not be able to move freely in a base any lower than that. You may also want to change your alarm bell settings to force your PALs to focus on work, as there are stray PALs that walk by and can distract your workers. With these structures set up in this fashion, you have just about the most optimal layout for ranch resource production. The only thing left to do is rank up your PALs to increase output. Because the PAL condenser increases the number of PALs required to rank up a PAL by 4 times from 1 to 2 stars, then double that to 3 stars, and double that again for 4 stars, you should always focus on leveling every single PAL you intend to have on your ranch by 1 star at a time before leveling a PAL over to the next star rating, as it's a much more efficient use of PALs. If you spent a few minutes catching chickpeas, you should be able to easily rank up most of them to at least 2 stars, if not all the way if you have the resources to do so. Bee guards are even higher priority since honey can't be purchased, but they are harder to catch en masse since they're higher level. Here's their general spawn area for manually catching them. They're not too hard to find. If you want to breed them, however, you'll either need a male and female bee guard, which is harder to find than you think, as the male ones are far less common at a rate of about 1 to 10, and they're the ones that like to blow themselves up whenever you get close to them, so you have to catch them pretty fast. Alternatively, you could use a Daydream and Matsurina, a Fuddler and Ectherdeer, a Tansy and Malpaca, or Tansy and Damud to make bee guards. I'd say these are the easiest pairs to find earlier game, though there are many other options if you already have a good chunk of all pals captured before starting this. I think 2 stars on your Chickapees and 1 star on your bee guards is a solid starting point that you can scale further over time as you please. Once you toss your pals into your breeding base and you've loaded your feeders with food, you'll officially have a steady supply of all your necessary cake ingredients, and all that's left to do is bake them before we start making some babies. For cake baking, I suggest baking on site so that you only have to move your flour and berries over from your farming base. Depending on your level and resources, you may or may not have the electric kitchen, which you unlock at level 41, as well as the flame cauldron at level 20, which I highly recommend purchasing as it can speed up production by around 20%, and is very easy to assemble. At a minimum, you'll need the regular cooking pot to bake cakes, but they take twice as long to cook compared to the electric kitchen. You would of course need to use up another pal for electricity to run the electric kitchen, but the way we'll be setting up this base calls for electricity anyway, so I still think it's the best option if you can get it. Depending on how many cakes you want to be cranking out per hour, and assuming you have a Yormantide Ignis with level 4 kindling and the flame cauldron, you can make around 120 cakes an hour with the electric kitchen. 60 with a regular cooking pot, which you could double if you want to recruit 1 more fire pal. I personally don't recommend cranking up your pal work speeds for cake production using the monitoring stand, as it's unlikely you'll be using more than 120 cakes an hour, let alone gathering enough resources for that many per hour. But if you really want to do it, then I'd say you're far better off baking cakes at a different base, since your ranged pals will be negatively impacted by this. If you don't have a Yormantide Ignis, here's where you can capture some, though they are quite high level. You'll probably be fine with a pal that only has 2 or 3 kindling, though it will obviously be slower. In any case, we've finally done it. We now have a reliable supply of cakes to get our pals in the mood to launch some disturbingly large eggs relative to their body size out of unknown orifices, ready to be fertilized by some pal fluids, and I'm not talking about those ones, so that we can slowly refine their genetic line down to the perfect version of every pal. So let's get our breeding farms and incubators set up and continue outfitting our base with the right tools for the job. Subscribe. Now, our ranches were fine to place on the absolute furthest edges of the base ring, and it wouldn't cause any problems, but I don't recommend doing the same for your breeding farms, as I've noticed pals can bug out quite easily when they're placed like this. Anytime you place your farms down with the hay bales outside of the ring, there is a chance that things will get wonky. I haven't noticed this ever happen as long as at least half of the hay bale is inside the ring, so use that as a general guideline for placement. I think 4 breeding farms is more than enough to meet all your breeding needs, and I like to place these all on the opposite side of my ranches to keep things spaced out and not have my pals accidentally get stuck in them. Anytime you have cakes to unload from your cooking pot or kitchen, you can throw them into the breeding farm chest and they'll never expire, so spread them out as you please. We obviously need to hatch these eggs, so we need to get some incubators placed down, and you have 2 options for this, and it's going to depend on how you're playing the game. If you're playing with your settings set to 0 for hatch time, then you're just insta-hatching everything, so just set up a single incubator wherever you want, and cycle through hatching your eggs right away. If you're doing an honest playthrough and are planning to wait for hatching, then I recommend placing your incubators completely above your main pal working areas to prevent any collision on the incubators. Set up as many as you feel necessary. You probably won't need many if you're breeding smaller eggs, but if you're farming pals from huge eggs that have long incubation times, then you'll definitely want to load up more to keep up with your egg output. Now, I talked about wanting electricity in my base before, and that was because you need it to push your heating up to the max amount necessary to speed up incubation for scorching and rocky eggs, which need to be hot. During the daytime, you'll need an electric heater running to get your 100% incubation bonus on these eggs, while you'll only need a basic heater for common, electric, and verdant eggs, which should be warm. Damp, dark, and frozen eggs don't need any cooling, as this area by default is cool enough to give them the 100% bonus right away. You could instead find an area that is hotter by default and then provide cooling for the necessary eggs instead, but that's totally up to you. It's all a matter of preference. You're gonna have to do something for some type of egg no matter what. For this setup, you will need to spare an additional pal in order to keep the heater running, and I suggest destroying the heater that will not be used so that it doesn't accidentally get activated by the dumb PAL AI. At nighttime, you'll see the temperature typically drop 1 heating unit lower than during the daytime, so if you're going to play through the in-game nighttime, you should adjust your heating accordingly during that time to keep your hatch rate maxed. Be sure to keep your heater on the ground floor of your base so that your heater PAL can actually access it, as it will not be able to go upstairs as the AI is too dumb. It's important to note that the heater range only seems to capture an area of about a 3-tile radius from where it was placed, so try to cluster your incubators around the spot you place your heater. Anything above the heater will be affected by this, so you can build multiple layers of incubators within that 3x3 space, and they'll all receive the heating bonus if you have a ton of eggs to hatch. I would, however, avoid placing breeding farms at higher floors of your base. Even though your pals technically shouldn't move once you place them in the pen, I've seen pals bug out up top, then stagnate egg production, and it's just a pain in the ass to have to bring them back up there if you need to reset them. Speaking of which, it's time to start chucking our pals into our breeding farms and making some eggs. Obviously, we need 1 male and 1 female pal and our cake for them to start getting freaky, but how do we ensure we're breeding towards the best possible traits for our pals? Which traits matter the most? How can we max out egg production? And how do we figure out how to hatch a specific pal from 2 different pals? First, some useful things to understand when it comes to pals producing eggs. When pals are placed in a breeding farm, they will not deplete their hunger or sanity levels, and typically opt to sleep in their pens as well. This is why I don't bother putting feed boxes near them, as they should never leave their pen area if things all go correctly. Second is that pals do occasionally bug out and will end up outside of the breeding workspace, usually when you log back into your world or fast travel back to your base. When this happens, you'll notice that the egg progress meter will not move at all, as the pals have to be inside of the breeding farm itself, despite the pal saying it's actively working. That's a lie. You're going to have to manually move them back in there, and this is precisely why I advise against having your breeding farms on elevated surfaces. Finally, actively producing eggs is yet another activity that is not impacted by work speed at all. I've seen people spread misinformation about this, saying you should adjust your monitoring stand to max it out since they don't lose sanity or deplete hunger, but I've tested this one too, and it has next to zero difference. Every single egg takes around 5 minutes and 30 to 40 seconds to lay. Doesn't matter which combination of pals are getting freaky or what the settings are on the monitoring stand, that's the time it takes to make an egg for the most part. If anything, the monitoring stand was maybe 3% faster, but I'm chalking that up to wonkiness with pals moving around the pen and accidentally stalling the egg timer randomly during tests, so it's simply not worth using the monitoring stand given the negative impacts it has on other areas of your base typically. Now let's talk about how to create a specific pal, as this will be fundamental to expediting trait farming later on. There is an underlying system tied to breeding where every pal has a breeding value, and when you throw 2 pals into a breeding farm, it averages those 2 breeding values and spits out an egg for a pal closest to that average value. Sometimes the value is equidistant from 2 pals, so there's a check order that determines which of those 2 pals gets selected in that case. I won't go into any more detail on this as it's not important for you to know, but that's the quick and dirty of how the system works. What some talented people have done with this information is create an exceptionally useful resource known as the Palworld Breeding Combinations and Calculator Google Sheet that has mapped out every possible breeding outcome in the game. I personally think this sheet is more useful than any other website with a Palworld breeding calculator. I highly recommend going to the link in the description or pinned comment to access this and make yourself a local copy for future use while bookmarking the original, as the creator does update it over time. The main reason I like this sheet so much is because you can easily see the pal deck number for all of the parent pals when searching for the pal child you want to breed in the parent search sheet. Most of the other sites just show the names of the pals, or even worse, show the pals out of pal deck order, which is extremely annoying. By having pal deck numbers, you can more easily understand whether you can take advantage of low pal deck number combos, as that's a generally accurate indicator of the difficulty required to catch each pal. I know that's not always the case, but it's pretty darn close. For example, if we wanted to breed an Anubis, we can see that there are quite a few very accessible combos to work with to get an early Anubis, such as Accelerate and Relaxorus, Panking and Bushy, Masanda and Catris, and more. None of which require endgame level 40 plus pals like Palladius or Frostallion to create. Now, there are ways to work from even lower rank pals than this by going 1 or 2 additional breeding steps deeper, where you'd, for example, breed out a Relaxorus with lower level pals instead of catching one, but it's honestly probably overkill in most cases, considering by the time you get any reasonable breeding operation set up, you'll have probably caught a solid number of all pals by then. Simply consult the sheet in the exact same manner, going one step deeper if this is something of interest to you. The process is identical. So sticking with our Anubis example, let's talk about how we'd go about breeding an ideal crafting Anubis and how the sheet can help us get there faster. In terms of target farming traits, we always want to know what our end goal is before going deep into an egg farming bout. For our Anubis example, let's hunt for workaholic, artisan, serious, and work slave. First, we want to look for any viable breeding pairs that contain any of the traits we're already looking for to speed up this process. We'll start by going into the parent search sheet, selecting Anubis as our child, then looking through our pal box for pals that are both on the list and contain ideally only a max of 2 traits, both hopefully being desired traits to our end target if possible, with one being male and the other being female. In this case, I have an Incineram Noct and a Serpent that have Artisan and Workaholic, which we do want, but unfortunately, Motivational Leader, which we don't need. This is completely okay as it's only one additional trait, and we're early into the cycle hunting for our other missing traits as well. We'll be able to get rid of this later. We throw them into a pen with some cake and let the lovemaking commence between our slippery friend and its horny counterpart as they incineram each other until an egg is yeeted out of an orifice. Yes, incineramming is the scientifically accurate lingo, don't question it. Let a few eggs get produced and then throw them into your incubators, waiting as long as you need based on your in-game settings, or not at all if you got eggs set to instant hatch. If you're successful in pulling an Anubis with both your Artisan and Workaholic only, congrats, you're off to a great start. If you only get one male with one trait and one female with one as well, that also works and you can start breeding them too in hopes of getting the other traits to show up in future generations. In most cases, however, you're going to start seeing other traits, most of which will be unwanted, showing up in your hatchlings. From the set of eggs you just saw pulled here, the best pull we had was an Artisan only Anubis, and then tied for second was an Artisan Workaholic Motivational Leader, and then an Artisan Workaholic Aggressive, the same value really. The Aggressive and Motivational Leader are unwanted, but it's still enough to work with to try and express our 2 missing traits, Serious and Work Slave, which unfortunately never showed in this batch at all. As you go through more eggs, you'll eventually pull another one of your 4 desired traits, and when that does happen, you're going to want to rotate that new pal into a breeding range to continue expressing that new trait more frequently, rather than banking on it naturally rolling. I don't have an exact number on how much more likely a trait is to be expressed when one or both parents have it, but I've linked to a Reddit post that seems to have gone quite deep into running the numbers on trait expression for different scenarios that's worth looking into if you want to have a more intimate understanding of the numbers and inner workings of this system. Over time, you're hopefully going to then have 2 of your 4 traits on one pal and 1 or 2 of your other 4 traits on another, with no straggler traits being expressed at all. This is the ideal situation to be in. This will give you the highest chance of landing a perfect world pal at about a supposed 10% success rate, and at worst, you'll start to roll pals with 3 of your 4 traits, which you can then swap in if desired as well, further increasing your chances of a perfect roll. So in this case, I got pretty unlucky, honestly, having to roll about 80 eggs before I ever saw Work Slave appear, and it showed up on a really shitty egg with 2 unwanted traits. Luckily, very shortly after, I rolled a plain Work Slave only egg and was able to pair that with an Anubis that had our other 3 wanted traits to roll the perfect pal. With enough generations passed, you should finally have a perfect rolled pal with all 4 traits, and if you're lucky, you can then quickly breed another one of the opposite gender with all 4 to crank out multiple perfect pals if it's a pal you want to have many of to work on your base for you. Over the course of this process, assuming you want to 4-star your perfect pal, then don't worry about producing a bunch of extra eggs over your generations as you slowly make progress, as you can just throw the shit ones into the pal condenser to rank up your perfect specimen once you have it. The breeding system as a whole is far from an exact science and more based on probability and optimizing slowly towards your perfect pal, but if you're making a conscious effort to rotate those better pals in incrementally as you get closer to the perfect one with each round of egg production, while omitting the unwanted traits, you'll naturally hit your perfect pal likely long before you create enough eggs to 4-star it. Another very important point to bring up is that once you have a perfect rolled pal like an Anubis, if you want to pass over its perfect roll to another type of pal, assuming there's a way to crossbreed from that Anubis plus one other parent pal, to your desired child pal, what you want to do is find a secondary parent with 0 unwanted traits and only matching perfect rolled traits. This will give you a very high probability right out of the gates to breed a perfect pal. I believe this would again be around that 10% chance. So once you've done the legwork to get a single perfect pal, it becomes very simple to transfer it over to other types of pals. A few other things to be aware of when it comes to breeding before we wrap up here. At most, you can have 20 eggs produced in a pen before your pals will stop producing eggs there, so you'll want to cycle out your eggs every 2 hours if you plan to max out production. I've recommended only 4 breeding farms for your base, as you likely won't be making enough cakes to sustain much more than that, but if you want, you can definitely squeeze a few more in if you've been smart with your space use with this build design. While all traits are possible to pass on to offspring through the parent, you can't roll every single passive trait out of thin air. The jury's still out on whether you can naturally roll lucky, but I've never seen it after hundreds of eggs myself, and you definitely can't roll any of the unique traits from legendary PAL bosses like the Lord of the Blank traits or Blank Emperor and Divine Dragon, along with the legend trait. You can pass all of these on though from the parent to the child if it possesses it. As it stands, there also doesn't seem to be any blockers in place that prevent a certain trait from appearing if another trait of a similar type is present. For example, you seem to be able to breed down all the worker traits like Serious, Artisan, and Work Slave, though it isn't clear whether their natural roll rate diminishes if a parent possesses one of these skills. I noticed it was very difficult for Work Slave to pop up for me once I had Artisan and Serious on one of my Anubises, so maybe that's just coincidence from a small sample size. I really don't know, honestly. Overall, your best bet is to always only breed using pals with the traits you want to express, accepting that some trash ones will flow into the mix as you hunt down other key traits. Once you have all 4 of those traits expressed, slowly refine them out to a point where you can find a breeding pair that only has the desired traits expressed and none of the useless shit that you don't need. And with average RNG, you should have around a 1 in 10 chance of rolling that perfect pal when all other conditions are met. I know this was a lot of information to take in, but hopefully you now have an optimized cake producing operation and all the tools and know-how to target farm traits for your perfect pals in the shortest number of generations possible. If you made it this far and enjoyed the video, drop a cake emoji in the comments and consider subscribing for more of the most in-depth, research-backed coverage of your favorite games. If you're looking for tips on how to optimize movement through the Palworld, make sure to check this video out next. I'll see you in the next one. Peace.